Good afternoon again. We will start the last session because before the closing words. This session is entitled Entangled Inequalities, Recent Developments in Latin America. And you know already Professor Jelin, you know already Professor Costa, and I would like to introduce you to Professor Lavinas. Lena Lavinas is Professor of Welfare Economics at the Institute of Economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and Senior Researcher of the Brazilian National Research Council. She got her PhD from the University of Paris, and she has just been appointed member of the International Advisory Board of Development and Change. She was also 12, 16, 17 fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, the WICO. And she has also been appointed a research fellow at the Brazil Research Center at the Latin America Institute, Freie Universität Berlin. She has been a visiting research scholar and visiting professor in the program of Latin American Studies at Princeton University in 2013. And she was also a fellow of the Research Network on Social Inequalities in Latin America at Freie Universität Berlin, desigualdades.net. Among her recent publications, you can find in Development and Change in 2018, the collateralization of social policy under financialized capitalism. And also a moment of equality for Latin America, challenges for redistribution, along with Barbara Fritz, Ashgate 2015, and her book, for which she is most known, I think, The Takeover of Social Policy by Financialization, The Brazilian Paradox. And it was published by Palgrave in 2017. So, thanks so much, Lena, for being here. We will hear you with pleasure.
I'm happy to be here today. Participate this first São Paulo Advanced School of Social Sciences, alongside Elizabeth Jelin, Sergio Costa, and Marcos Nobre, in addition to all of you. I would like to thank Maria Hermínia, Professor Maria Hermínia, Professor Marta Machado, and all those who participate in the organization of this advanced school. So I have good news for you. First, I will be presenting some data. People complained that there was no data, so we're going to have a lot of data. And the second good news is that I have shortened my presentation by 1/3, because I think it's getting late, it's a late session, and I'm supposed to head to the airport very fast after the end of this panel. And I think that the most important would be to have a good discussion on issues that I hope I will be correctly addressed here. Oops. So when speaking about inequality in Latin America, one runs the risk of being redundant. In terms of income and wealth inequality, it's clear that the last decade was one of relative stagnation. Inequality remained at extremely high levels, even through a period of a return to growth and a highly favorable external environment, the most surprising result of which has been to plunge the region back into a past it seems incapable of shaking off. Extractivism has been revived on a massive scale amidst intense and amplifying process of deindustrialization, expropriation, and violence, worsening the commodification of nature. Structural heterogeneity remains intact, despite the real rise in wages and a significant improvement in the rate of formal employment. Regressive taxation has proved resistant to center-left governments who cast themselves as progressive. On a positive note, the incorporation into the mass consumer society of wide contingents of the excluded has emerged as the greatest benefit of poverty-fighting policies, thanks to cash transfer programs hailed as the more effective means of pulling people out of extreme deprivation. Cash transfer programs were crucial to expanded monetization levels in Latin America, and notably among the poorest. Despite this stagnation in income, and a history marked by paradoxes, some of the many dimensions of inequality seem to be giving way, thanks to equalization mechanism at work during the period of inclusive economic growth. Inclusion was the watchword signaling promising trends and high hopes for the region. Novel dynamics of inclusion engendered great expectations. Scholars such as Goran Terman, already mentioned by Sergio Costa and Elizabeth Jelin, for instance, came to state that although income inequality and vital inequality had not made important strides as expected, existential equalization, by contrast, had indeed advanced in Latin America, given the greater protagonism of subaltern social actors such as indigenous people, women, and Afro-descendants. I would argue that criminalization of indigenous communities who resist the violation of their rights, the unprecedented number of brutal murders of environmental defenders, the racism and discrimination which continue to claim thousands of lives and drive mass incarceration, and the savage repression of women for having claimed control over their bodies and sexuality, and who continue to be the victims of an epidemic of violence. Let us not forget that of the 10 countries with the highest rates of femicide, 7 are Latin American. All these are not a temporary paradox in the process of development, but rather long-lasting existential inequalities that have survived market incorporation in Latin America. This has been the great change of recent years, a sign of the transition to a mass consumer economy without a real transformation of inequality reproducing structures. There is, however, one more piece to consider as we struggle with the great jigsaw of our inequalities. My aim here today is to reflect upon one dynamic of inclusion set in motion in Latin America during the pink tide, which is still being pursued and deepened, with severe consequences for people's well-being. It may widen inequality income, and it will certainly increase socioeconomic insecurity and vulnerability for the worse off and for middle-income sectors. In this sense, after listening to Marcos Nobre's talk earlier today, I would modestly say that what I'll be showing here is somehow a diagnosis of time. I'm referring to a massive process of financial inclusion rooted in the multiplication of mechanisms of the production and reproduction of debts and the commodification of goods and services that the expansions of rights has sought to decommodify through social policy. On one side, we are witnessing the scaling down of social protection schemes and coverage as a consequence of austerity policies in times of neoliberal financialization. Therefore, the potential for redistribution is being forcefully constrained. At the same time, the liberalization and deregulation of the financial sector have facilitated an exceptional expansion of the finance industry, making an array of products and services accessible to the public at large, with an offering that has only grown in scope and variety, tracking along with innovations in information technology. Finance has emerged as an alternative in the face of the sharp downturn in the public provision of education, healthcare, and pensions. To put things another way, the key idea is that to protect one's basic livelihood, it is imperative to take risks. In Robert Shiller's word, and you know that Robert Shiller was the Nobel winning prize in economics in 2014, one must, and I quote, take greater risks for good purposes if the ultimate goal is to surmount risk. Since modern finance has a bountiful array of risk management industries designed to provide a certain measure of economic security in times of economic hardship and welfare losses, all that would remain to do would be to establish the necessary links in a more proactive manner, a role to be assumed by the state responsible for providing legal environment through which to facilitate the functioning of these extended financial markets. The lack of data to consistently address how debt and permanent indebtedness reshape dynamics of inequality in Latin America beyond the inherent pervasive logic of interest-bearing capital accumulation makes it difficult to grasp debt's evolving influence on people's daily life. But what we do already know is that debt, or the creditor-debtor relationship based on dependence and on domination, is a persistent cause of dispossession and impoverishment. The novelty of what we are seeing now is that households are experiencing permanent indebtedness, some in the form of a mortgage and more often in the form of consumer credit. Rising debt-to-income ratios are not only a concern in advanced economies, but in the developing world as well. While in the former, mortgage debt makes up the bulk of household debt, around 50%, in the emerging market economies, debt is mainly linked to consumer credit at about 65%. What is striking is that, according to numerous surveys by the MEF, by the way, the share of low-income households in total debt has grown and keeps growing pretty fast. None of this, of course, is by chance. As synthesized by Streeck, debt is a temporary solution to distributive conflicts in times of austerity. To understand contemporary societies today and the social and economic solutions that constitute them, it is imperative to apprehend the role of debt as one of the central social control mechanisms of the current moment, which has been largely shaped by far-reaching process of financialization. So this is my backdrop, and now I'll get more properly into my presentation that is divided in 3 parts, and I'm gonna show you some graphs and maps that have been made by my graduate students who are very, very good in doing beautiful figures like this. First, I will briefly characterize financialization itself, then working off a few graphs, I'll bring evidence that Latin America is not immune to the process of financialization, though we still lack data on a scale that would allow for more fine-grained analysis of the impact of financialized capitalism. This lacuna is said to be redressed, however, by an international task force led by the IMF and the World Bank, which, alongside with country central banks and in partnership with countless ministries, have been developing top-down strategies to stimulate and monitor the so-called financial inclusion. The time has long passed in which the central bank's main role, besides ensuring macroeconomic stability, was to keep the employment rate up. Since the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, the massification of the process of full financial inclusion has become a priority as an inherent crucial dimension of the consolidation of the hegemony of financial capital. The watchword is the promotion of financial inclusion, which means pulling the adult population into the financial sector. This no longer means just opening accounts. Now it implies consuming a myriad of financial products, notably credit. The focus is on low-income sectors who suffer from precarious insertion in the job market. The base assumption here is that improved access to formal financial services supports development. It follows that such policies should be amply spread throughout developing countries to allow households and individuals to move beyond short-term planning and formulate intertemporary strategies in the attempt to preserve their well-being, save, invest in education, no longer a right but a rational choice made possible by access of loans, or take out insurance policies where the highly segmented offering presents the opportunity to attenuate or prevent risks in case of illness, unemployment, or loss of well-being. The insurance industry has thus become a new and indispensable ally in the fight against poverty, in the prevention of risks which were once addressed by social insurance and by social policies with coverage that tended towards universality. Secondly, I will focus on the state's role in this process and how it builds social policy to lay down the new rules in keeping with this financial logic. In addition to the bancarization of the low-income groups, we see their growing participation as borrowers. And finally, I will show some data on Brazil's debt-to-income ratios for households and defaults level. So the adoption of national strategies of financial inclusion has clearly widespread. This graph shows the high percentage of countries across a number of regions. I'm talking about developing countries, okay, not advanced economies, including Latin America, which have declared that they are either in the process of implementing a number of initiatives along these lines or have already done so, clearly in step with austerity policies ballasted by cuts to public spending and taxes. But how to characterize financialization? Financialization is a process by which financial institutions, financial markets, and financial actors gain influence over the real economy. It's not only a matter of the greater weight of finance, but notably of a much wider scope of applications with detrimental effects, not only on firms and on the process of accumulation and industrialization, but also on our well-being. Financial markets and transactions overshadow production and trades nowadays. Profit-making tends to occur increasingly through financial channels rather than through productive activities, disseminating shareholder value as the mode of corporate governance. This financial valorization of capital transfers the bulk of the accumulation process from production to property, strengthening rentier incomes and interests. Interest in buried capital takes the lead in producing wealth for the few. To sum up, finance-dominated capitalism is a new regime of accumulation under neoliberalism. There are various dynamics and dimensions to the financialization process. To grasp the general trend, scholars usually try to make out the size of the financial sector. One way of going about it consists of calculating the value of assets held by financial institutions relative to GDP. And when we're talking about financial assets, we're talking about bonds, who are, as you know, debts, and also equities and derivatives. The figures plotted by Macquarie, which is a private entity, a private organization who provides information to the financial sector, show the strong continuous growth rate of global financial assets since the late 90s, even as global GDP growth started stalling. This is the proof that capital is migrating out of the real economy. So you have this gray bar, which means shadow banking. As you know, shadow banking are those financial institutions that are not controlled and they are not supposed to follow regulations established by the third Basel Accord that has been signed in 2010 after the great financial crisis, okay? Because the idea was that it was necessary again to regulate, to strengthen regulations on the financial sector, on the banking system, increasing requirements for the banks, and also reducing their leverage, But what we see is that, you see, from 2010 to 2015, the shadow banking system is increasing their participation in the financial markets, and they escape all kinds of regulations, okay? They cannot be regulated. Oops. So the picture varies very little in Latin America. Using this measure of stock, total banking assets relative to national GDPs as a proxy of financialization, I have plotted a map showing how financialization has spread very rapid in Latin America since the early 2000s. In the period leading up to 2016, the degree of financialization measured along these lines grew significant in the United States. Total banking assets in the US came to 450% of GDP, as opposed to 350 at the turn of the century. You see that Canada, the color is lighter, because after the 2008 crisis, there was a reduction in financial assets in Canada and in some other countries. Argentina singles out in this map because Argentina has a very low, a very poorly developed financial system. In Argentina, the rich people, the firms, they don't buy stocks, they don't buy derivatives, they don't get into the financial sector. What they prefer is to have dollars, since the corralito. And this is a big problem because the financial system is not really developing in Argentina. So Argentina has a very low level of financialization compared to other Latin American countries. So here we have a closer look that reveals that of the 10 countries studied, in 7 of them, the value of total banking assets has outstripped 100% of GDP. The most surprising case is Chile, where those assets now represent over twice the value of the country's GDP. Trajectories across the region are hardly uniform and vary from country to country. Nevertheless, the clear trend is towards the advancing concentration of wealth in financial corporations. Leaving the macro level to analyze the process of financial inclusion itself, we see that bancarization has been a powerful mechanism in the constitution of what is called inclusive financial systems, that mantra of the new millennium. In just 3 years, while the number of those with a bank account rose 12% across the population as a whole, that figure goes up more quickly by 17% when we look at the poorest 40% of the population. When we disaggregate the data by country and look at the lowest income groups, this reveals the rapid growth of bank accounts among the lowest income group. In Mexico, Uruguay, and Peru, coverage triples. In Argentina and Guatemala, it doubles. It's plausible that if this survey had been taken during the early 2000s, the proportion of those with bank accounts would have been negligible across the board. Among the mechanisms that drove the financial inclusion of low-income households, all regions of the developing world, including Latin America, which is the red bar, have seen a state-led strategy. Encouraging or mandating recipients of government transfers to open an account was clearly an extremely effective initiative, and it reveals the integration of strategy between the state and the financial sector. The states around the world have embraced finance-friendly policies, and this is especially the case for Latin America. But what did facilitate the task? Special modality of social policy, cash transfer guaranteed to the poor and low-income families, groups, with the state as an underwriter. So what we witnessed during the 2000s in Latin American country was a huge expansion of welfare programs, providing cash to poor families conditional on school attendance and medical visits. And except very few countries such as Nicaragua, all Latin American countries have improved this kind of anti-poverty policy very successfully because it costs very low. It's less than 0.5% the GDP, and it has a huge impact in bringing people into the market, in monetizing the poor. So we see that in most countries, we see that we have the poorest also receiving government transfers in the past year. So the World Bank survey, however, reveals something unique to the Latin American continent. One way of boosting insertion into the financial markets, democratizing access and reducing information asymmetries in the use of financial products is through financial literacy programs. The graph confirms an unsurprising reality. While income transfer programs in Latin America once called for mandatory school attendance and medical checkups, now 50% of them require adults to attend financial education courses as well as distributing textbooks on the topic in schools. A huge program along these lines is already being implemented in Brazil by the central bank with Bolsa Família welfare recipients. But state encouraged bancarization as a means of accessing social benefits was just the beginning. The new phenomenon we're seeing in Latin America of an unprecedented scale is the mass indebtedness made possible, among other factors, by the speed at which credit access has expanded, particularly consumer credit, and the relaxing of credit requirements, which had been one of the pillars of financial deregulation. It's quite likely that these figures from the World Bank survey are underestimated. The graph reveals, in any case, that taking out loans is a practice that occurs along the income distribution curve at similar proportions. Hence, it's relatively symmetrical, and its dimensions are hardly insignificant. We do find an asymmetry, however, in the respective ability of those two groups to pay back those loans. Markets for consumer credit have doubled in many Latin American countries over the course of the 2000s. This is the reflection, among other things, not just of stagnation or falling salaries, a trend clear in developed economies, but of the shrinkage of incomplete public welfare systems and the increased flexibility and insecurity of job relations, forcing many to take on debts. Since most central banks fail to provide data on household indebtedness across the countries analyzed here, I will work exclusively now with the results put out by the Brazilian Central Bank. We have very good data in Brazil on debt, indebtedness, ratio to income, debt to income ratios, etc. This graph indicates the impact of the swift advance of consumer credit and mortgage credit on the share of Brazilian households' income. And the income here is disposable income. It's a methodology that has been established by the Brazilian Central Bank itself. So it's post-transfers and post-tax, okay? So we see that the rate rises from 18 to 28% in the case of consumer credit and from 21 to 48% when mortgages are included. What is most worrisome, however, is that when one considers solely those who take out loans, the borrowers, so it's the figure on the right, the debt-income ratio comes to an average 64% of households' disposable income. For those earning between 1 and 3 times the minimum wage, it stands at over 70%. Since default depends on the degree to which household income is compromised by repayment and interest-related expenses, there is no doubt that the group most at risk of default are precisely those at the tail end of the income distribution. Among the reasons for taking out loans, the 2 most common answers by far indicate that the funds go to buy durable goods and pay household bills, ordinary expenses, that is. in the extreme short term with neither contributing to the household's assets. People go into debt to acquire that which their salaries ought to pay for, or to obtain goods and services that should have been included in decommodified public provision. People are taking out credit to finance daily consumption. According to a survey carried out by Sistema de Proteção ao Crédito and Confederação Nacional dos Dirigentes Lojistas last year, the first item responsible for household default is clothing. The second one, purchase in supermarket, mostly food. After 2 years, so let's look more closely on what we call the default levels who are on the rise. After 2 years of deep recession, Brazilian households have reached an extremely concerning state of debt and default. Let's focus on 2017. In June 2017, almost 60 million Brazilian adults have declared that they were in default to the financial sector, 93% belonging to classes C, D, and E. And as of January 2018, 69% of all Brazilians declared that they were unable to have made savings for the last 12 months, which means that debt will continue to be crucial to make ends meet. We are getting addicted to debt. And as a consequence, we are threatening our autonomy and freedom and getting more and more debt dependent. Financial inclusion is not an emancipatory move, just to connect what Marcos Nobre developed to us earlier today. So to conclude, I would like to sum up some ideas. Today, we are invited to live by finance. Mass indebtedness has become a marker of social inclusion, and the constant renegotiation of debt has been cast as an alternative to marginalization. Households and individuals internalize the notion that financial markets and dependence on credit could provide a response to their concern and their needs. The turn to finance-dominated capitalism has brought new blueprints for social policy as well. In this process, recommodification takes over from decommodification, and that now serves as an alternative to exclusion by way of financial inclusion. While unexplored mechanisms of expropriation arise, the expression over-indebtedness, so commonly used today, may rapidly lose its meaning if what it designates becomes the common lot in the age of financialization. That appears to be essential to survive or to thrive, to escape poverty, as well as to enjoy economic security. In parallel, redistributive conflicts will continue to be masked by growing access to credit and loans, most often to meet daily needs and cope with contingency. Today, that is reshaping the role of the state, and this is why Susan Soderberg, who is a German political scientist who works in Canada, she has coined the concept of the debt-fair state. The content of citizenship and the ways individuals become part of a global market consumer society and relate to one another. That also defines one's future's opportunity, since modern finance has upended the logic of access to rights. Will need to be turned into wants, sweeping away rights. Since the 90s, consumer credit is largely financed by securitization, which means that pools of loans or debt obligations that generate cash flows sold on, are now increasingly sold on capital markets. Lending, that is, debt creation, is therefore necessary for the development of a crucial dimension of modern finance, securitization, which is a financial segment largely unregulated. Being in debt and living in debt may become the norm, notably in times of neoliberal austerity policies. Instead of consuming credit to buy commodities and services, people may consume debt. So it goes without saying that financial inclusion does not pave the way to emancipation and freedom from domination. So despite this very brief presentation with some data, I hope that I could introduce one dimension, one extra dimension of inequality that I think has not still been, taken in our debates. We're always looking to the income distribution, terms of distribution, looking the way we can also measure fiscal revenues and tax declarations. But there is something that is completely put aside, which is the fact that disposable income is shrinking for families in general, because they will have to pay now to have access to some basic services that used to be provided by the state, like health, education, and things like this. But at the same time, they have to take on credit, to take on loans in order to finance their daily needs. And this is something that we need to produce data, good data, to measure how it affects inequality dynamics in our countries. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, my first temptation would be to react to Lena's really intriguing presentation, but I leave this for the discussion, and I will just try to understand some political dynamics of inequality and inequality mitigation in Latin America. And I was already accused to have a very Brazilo-centric scheme to understand inequality, saying Latin America, but at the end of the day, I'm talking about Brazil. This is what colleagues from other countries are saying, but I will try to, the question I'd like to address is quite simple, there is a kind of discussion on the legacy of the so-called pink tide in Latin America. And this pink tide, as you know, is, so to say, the progressive governments we have had in different countries, including Brazil, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Uruguay, Venezuela, in different times. And some scholars, including Joran Termbon, already mentioned here, tried to see there a kind of construction of equality in times in which in all other regions of the world you have increasing inequalities. So they try to emphasize the political aspect of inequality, saying that Latin American countries, against the global trend, have been able to reduce inequality. But I'd like to put this question in another way. If you had these leftist or at least progressive governments, they were elected with a flagship which was the mitigation of inequality. So my question would be the opposite. It would be how did these governments so feel for mitigating inequalities? They did a lot for combating and also for reducing poverty. In some cases, poverty was reduced to about 50%, as in case of Brazil. I think in Argentina even more than 50%. But in terms of inequality, the results are quite moderate. And the question is why? For understand this, we have, of course, to go into the national arenas and try to understand what kind of constellation of political forces led to these moderate results in terms of reducing inequality. And the answer to this question should be, and this is what could be a contribution to the discussion, should be addressed at least 6 factors, which I go through very quickly. The first one, if you compare other national projects, such as the developmentalist project, or also the democratization project, which were at that time, when they appeared, really national projects involving all national actors in an attempt to transform societies. You don't have the same kind of national encompassing project in case of inequalities. So it seems to me that to have a kind of exhaustion of national grand narratives in case of inequalities. Even if governments were elected promising fighting and promising mitigating inequalities, this has never been really a kind of national project as developmentalism and democratization were. The second aspect is kind of erosion of national public spheres. If you compare the context of democratization with the context of promotion of mitigation of inequalities, you have different public sphere in both cases. In case of democratization, you have somehow a national public sphere in which actors could bring arguments for democratization. In case of mitigation of inequalities, you have a completely different context. You have a context in which public spheres were quite divided, where in context in which fake news and hate shirts and so on were really on the core of the public sphere. So you have a different context in which these, so to say, discussions on equality and inequalities took place. The third argument why these governments were not were able, so to say, to fight against inequality is the unstable parliamentary base. This is very much the case of Brazil, but this is also the case even of Argentina and also Chile. So even these governments were elected, they didn't have a easy majority at the parliamentarian level and had to go into some negotiations in which the rich and also sectors such as, in case of Brazil, agribusiness, the bank sector, and other economic sectors, they had to make a lot of concessions to this group, limiting their power for reducing inequalities. Another factor that should be addressed also in not only in Brazil, but also I think it's also relevant, at least in case of Chile, Argentina. Perhaps you can comment on this, Chevy, because I don't know the importance of this factor, is the emergence of the so-called new middle classes. Of course, there is an important discussion on conceptual discussion if this is a new middle class or not. I'm just putting this, so to say, this topic in the agenda. And what it seems to me that the new middle classes, with some aspirations of consumption, and perhaps also of debt, as Lena just showed, this is not a kind of, so to say, not a kind of, they are not, so to say, stable electors which really support leftist governments for a long time. They are more concerned on individual mobility and more consumption than in support agenda of, so to say, a political agenda of equality. I'm not, of course, charging the new middle class for the failures of progressive governments. I'm just saying that differently from, I don't know, a working class, which which acts as a collective actor in certain times in different countries, we didn't have this kind of support, political support for the leftist governments, even by their electors. So their electors were more interested in individual mobility than in a political agenda. We had also, in different countries, a resistance of the so-called established middle class, which see that their symbols of distinction, such as consumption patterns, such as use of some spaces, also occupied by this so-called new middle classes. And this established middle class represented an important resistance against more redistributive policies. Finally, and this is perhaps a central issue, and I think not yet addressed in the form it should be addressed, is what a Peruvian economist calls the capturation of states by the rich. So states also under progressive governments in Peru, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile, were literally captured by the rich, by some economic groups which put states to serve these groups against the interests of majority. So they push for laws, they push for legislative chains in order to benefit themselves against the interest of the majority. And this was not only in case of Brazil, in case of different countries. You see Odebrecht is an actor in different countries in Latin America today, is also involved in corruption in different countries. So this corruptive power of these big companies and their pressures over national governments in order to promote their own interests had to be addressed, according to my view, as an important factor which have hindered more emphatic redistributive policies. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I will start with some data that came out in the newspapers in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, last week. It was data on school performance, and it was the tests that they do in secondary schools at the secondary level. And it shows the following. I'll give you just two data, but if you want more, I have more here. One is the percentage below the basic level, the percentage of high school students who performed less than what somebody defines as the minimum level. In public schools, 49.5%. In private schools, 26.7%. According to socioeconomic status of the family, here the data come differentiated by mathematics and lingua, to say lingua, whatever. In English, how do you say lingua? Lingua. English. Yeah. English, you call it English. You would say English, exactly. That goes for your epistemological inequalities. That language is English. Let's take the data for Spanish. Among the high level, it's the percentage below basic level is 7.3. Among the lowest third of the population, it's 31.8. In math, it's similar but higher, 21 and 60. The newspapers also carried stories about whether there were the differences by whether the child went or did not go to preschool education, indigenous versus non-indigenous populations, whether the adolescent works or doesn't work, whether they have, if the woman, the adolescent has a child or not, and so on. Why do this data matter, and what do I want to say with this data? I imagine that these are data from Argentina, but they shouldn't be very different, especially the differentials between public, private, or according to socioeconomic level. The first thing that they say for Argentina, this is very significant historically, is that performance is very bad, that the school is not doing its job in general, that schools are bad. And the international school scores of Argentina show it, the PISA and the other, it's bad news all over, which comes with a history of an egalitarian system, a public system, egalitarian system of education in Argentina, which comes from 1870 and the law of universal lay and free education and the implementation along 150 years of this system. And I would say that since the 1950s, the basic public system of education became worse and worse and worse and worse. And the private system, which did not exist before 1950 because the law of education was lay, universal, free, and the private system, which was only mostly schools of the Catholic Church, showed never was a good performer. For many years it was worse than the public, and now it's the reverse. At the same time that we see a decline in performance, we do see an increase in attendance. That is, more kids, with the usual measures of education, you see that more kids now graduate from high school, a higher percentage of the population goes to university, and so on and so forth. So what you have is a system but that it seems to be more inclusive, and at the same time, it's more exclusionary, that's it. So, we talked before about the state and redistribution. What is the state doing here? The first thing that I would say is the state is not opening up opportunities, even if we do not talk about equality of results, but equality of opportunity. The state in the public school system is not opening up. It's not acting in a redistributive, equalizing path, but on the contrary, it's acting towards the reproduction of inequalities. Usually, I said it before, I've been saying it for a long time, the family reproduces inequality, the state, especially through the educational system, has the role of reverting, mitigating, redressing issues of inequality in the short run and in the long run. Because this data on school performance imply longer term, the reproduction of inequality in the longer term, because these kids, when they get to the labor market, they will be disadvantaged, and this disadvantage in the labor market will then reproduce itself intergenerationally. So I think that when we look at this type of information and this type of data, we are in the presence, and we ask what is the state doing, state in different levels, and what are state policies. So the question is, these are results from 2017, and government changed in 2015, so school performance does not depend on a short conjunctural change of president. So these are data that reflect much more the last 15 years rather than the last year. So going back to your question, or to your thing, what did a progressive government do? What do progressive governments do or don't do in terms of redressing issues of inequality? I think that, in general, what I saw is that the policies of these progressive governments have been rather short-term, and not looking for longer-term policies. So in terms of well-being of societies, no big investments in health, in childcare, and in education, which would be an issue of at least equality of opportunity, if not equality of results. Some of the measures that are short-term or immediately, some of the well-being measures, some of the social programs, at least in Argentina, had interesting effects. I will mention one, and then there was one of the provisions of the Kirchner government had to do with pensions and retirement. There was, and this is an issue that is being discussed a lot, what the government did was to do a moratorium on retirement contributions, which means if you didn't have enough years of employment in order to retire, or you were a housewife, or you were in and out formal employment or so on, you could still retire. The way of doing it was that you would have a debt towards the state, but the debt was going to be paid by diminishing a little bit your retirement payment. This implies that nowadays in Argentina, about almost everybody gets retirement payment if they are in the ages that they are supposed to be retired. And the minimum retirement payment is not insignificant. It's about $350 per month, which compared to Bolsa Familia, to the retirement, not the Bolsa Familia, the ones here in Brazil or in other countries, it's a significant amount of money. It's hard to live on it, but it makes a big difference. One of the interesting facts of this, and this was not in the governmental plan, is that it had a big effect on women, because those who did not have enough years of work, or who were housewives, could have their own income now. So it was an equalizing, gender-based equalization of income and of empowerment of these women who had their own money and did not have to depend on others, while at the same time it was a measure that did not take into account a longer-term perspective. So I would say that it was, and like this, I could go into other policies of other governments, and not only on the Argentine government, that you could say that there was lots of policies dealing with recognition or partial recognition, and at times compensation in terms of gender, in terms of indigenous peoples, but not affecting key variables that produce inequality. And so that we have had important policies of recognition, but at times, or mostly, not accompanied by the redistributive or redress policies that would be required for that recognition. So again, we come to the dilemmas of equality and difference, the redistribution and recognition paradox that Nancy Fraser and others have put to us in the table. So this is just a few thoughts on the subject, and let's discuss.
We are open for questions, please. Oh, can we have the micro there? Okay.
First of all, thank you all very much for a very interesting panel.
Sorry, could you present yourself?
Oh, yes, sorry. I'm Douglas Block. I'm from the University of Pittsburgh. So my question is we've seen several panels now on inequality, and people have been talking about government programs. But no one's talked anywhere about family planning, which I think some of the things that I brought up about like teen mothers, if you have teen mothers, they're pretty much, you're going to guarantee poverty forever. So I guess my question is what role does family planning, not just abortion, but just general family planning, play in all of this? And then a second, it's unrelated question. So with the idea of debt, so this kind of seems to be, I guess, kind of the switch off, which is you're more equal citizens, but now you're equally in debt, so reducing inequality in one sense, increasing in the other. How about other policies like that? So where I live in Chicago, we had a policy where they said we're going to tax sodas because basically poor people drink too much soda and it's bad for them, so we're going to help their health by forcing them to pay more to sodas. So I guess what's the role of government in that, or is that a bad policy, or is that a good policy to force people to reduce inequalities?
Well, thank you so much for the very interesting presentations. I have two observations. One is for Sérgio, the other is for Elizabeth. About the issue of mid-income groups. I have wrote a paper with Fernando Guarnieri about this, and I don't like to use the term middle class because I think it doesn't help us to understand what has happened, and what we look to the public opinion polls regarding voting preferences in Brazil since the 90s, and this group is sharply divided. You cannot say they vote for the center to the left coalition or to the center of to the right coalition, because it's clearly divided, and the poorer you are inside this group, you tend to vote for the left, and the highest you are in this straight, you tend to vote to the center right. It's kind of obvious, but it's like that, but it's really divided. This point one. The second one, we both, Fernando Guarnieri and I, had conducted a survey with this group of people. And the problem, and we got a very interesting result, because when you ask, did your life improve? Those that think that, and why you ask why, those that think that their life improved, they attributed the improvement to their own efforts, to the family, and to God. And those that think that their life got worse, they attributed this to the government. And to the federal government, state government, municipality, and well, God has nothing to do with this. and my family also. And sometimes I didn't do enough effort, and so I can be blamed, but not so much. The blame goes to the government. So it depends much on how you interpret what has happened with you, and not only your position in the income hierarchy. The second is for you, Elizabeth. Thinking about the data of Brazil regarding education. First of all, basic education in Brazil is basically public education. The private education is a small percentage.
This is secondary.
Even in the secondary a little, but both sectors are very heterogeneous. They are generally, education in Brazil is terrible, very, very bad, probably worse than in Argentina. But the sectors are very heterogeneous. The public sector is in education is heterogeneous, and the private also. We tend to think the private sector as those schools where we send our children, but it is not that. So, thank you so much.
I'll take this.
You have to answer some.
No, but I'm going to ask Sérgio. So the point is, we're talking about middle classes just because people started purchasing fridges or, I don't know, going to a pizzeria on Sundays and things like this. And when we look back to what happened with this process of mass incorporation after World War II in Europe, and massively in the United States, we had the middle class, and we had this popular class, the working class, who started consuming. So it didn't mean that they were middle classes. But here in Latin America, because of the ideology of this left-center governments, the idea that people started consuming, buying durable goods, etc., that this was a big structural shift, and this is not true. What is the welfare state in Nordic countries? It's an alliance between the middle classes and the working classes. And the working class, the popular sector of the society, they have a better way of living. So they have access to different durable goods, to social housing, things we don't have, etc. So what is interesting is that the process of mass incorporation in Europe and in the United States after World War II implied that the working class was benefiting from this. This was the Fordist model, okay? $5 a day, people had to buy things, and they had access to credit, etc. So why in Brazil we think that this was a new middle class? Just because, you see, they were improving a bit the consumption of durable goods. Because there was no alliance between the upper middle class, the middle class, and the working class. We reduced access to basic provision. Healthcare in Brazil deteriorated a lot over the last 15 years. Education deteriorated. If we look at the income distribution across all tenths of the distribution, even among the 10th poorest, the bottom 10th, we're going to see that some families move their kids from public school to private school because as soon as the income, the household income rises a bit, people look for the private because they think it's better, and because the public is really deteriorating fast. So the point is, my question is, why are we talking about middle classes? We're talking about working classes, and the working class has the right to consume durable goods. It's a necessity for capitalism. And this is what happened in this country. We incorporated everybody into the market. There was a huge market inclusion everywhere throughout Latin America. It's not exclusive to Brazil. It was throughout it, and this is why it was a novelty. But we haven't changed what changed in Europe, because mass incorporation and also improvements in, let's say, the working class contribute to reduce structural heterogeneity, not among us. That's the point. We preserve the same bad structures we had in the past. So the point is, you see, it was incorporation into the market, but the fact that there was no structural shift, we created the idea that it's just because people are consuming fridges and I don't know what other durable goods, that they are part of the middle class. This is not being part of the middle class, because being part of the middle class supposes also participating in decision-making, have an influence in the definition of priorities in a society and other things. So we're not taking this into consideration. So my question is, why? What is this new middle class?
So, I just got the data about the secondary. So it's impressive. It's 1 million among 8 million. So it makes 12.5%.
Of what?
Of private.
Of private schools.
So, yeah. Yes, it's, no, it's 18. It's amazing. I thought it was the reverse, but just to give a number.
Okay, family planning. Okay, we had a very low fecundity rate, as you know, in Brazil. For now, it's 1.7, and it continues to drop. So this was a big shift. This is something that helped reduce poverty levels in Latin America in general, and Brazil in particular. Because, of course, you see families, even among the poor, the size of families is around, 3.7 people. It's less than 4. So I think that, you see, the big problem is when you talk about abortion, we're not talking about family planning, we're talking about civil rights for women, which is completely different. So I think that still in Bolivia and Ecuador, we have high fecundity rates, but they're dropping very fast as well. So I think this is not a big issue for Latin America in any case. So regarding that, of course, the government can provide a lot of different incentives. And this is what the government does when, for instance, there are tax breaks for the rich who put their kids in private schools or who buy healthcare premiums on a monthly basis. So, for instance, Brazil is a unique country. Even in the United States, you're American. When you deduct from your tax declaration expenditures on health, there is a limit. It's unlimited in Brazil. You can deduct whatever you want. So it was not like this. There were limits that have been increased during the 80s, but when Lula arrived in 2006, he decided to abolish any limit. So it was a decision by the Workers' Party, okay? So this is my second question to Sérgio. I would like to know when it was written in the Workers' Party that they were really committed to reduce inequality. But because, you see, I was militating in the party at that time, and I had never heard about this. But anyway, so of course we can have good consumption and bad consumption, and this is why the idea that I will orient the choices of the poor. Some think that the poor make bad choices, so we have to replace their choices, and the government decides what to offer to them. But I think that even the World Bank has changed on this. In the mid-90s, the World Bank was completely opposed to cash transfers provided to the poor, because they thought that they would create inefficiencies, since they would spend the money with bad consumption, alcohol and things like this. But they moved to a different strategy in the early 2000s when the World Bank adopted the idea, the strategy of social risk management. And the idea is that everybody needs a basic income, a floor, not a basic, sorry, a minimum income, because we live in a market society. And this is why now even the most ultra-liberal people, they agree that we should provide some cash to the poorest or to the low income, etc. This is not a problem. The problem is if we want to have the state providing also decommodified service and health, and this is what is really changing nowadays. So what we see is that the government is providing a lot of cash transfers, and this is the idea of the collateralization of social policy, either contributory benefits or non-contributory benefits, but the idea is that we give cash, a minimum, and all the rest, people, either they have money enough, and if not, they can go to the bank and they can take out loans and then look for what they want, because this will make them more responsible for their own choices. So I think that, you see, things have changed radically, and there is now a divide between what the state should provide and it's cash, and it's not decommodified services and goods.
So thank you for the questions. Also on the issue middle class, I mentioned in this very, very brief presentation or discussion, middle class here was used as a kind of emic, native category. So it's, we are talking about political conflicts and how political conflicts hinder some more emphatic programs of redistribution. And I was claiming that the issue on middle class is an important issue to understand political conflicts. Without use middle class in sense, sociologists used to use the concept middle class, mostly, as you know, at least they define middle class according to three issues. The first one is self-identification. In case of Argentina, if I remember well, Argentina is the most middle-class country in Latin America because the population classified themselves, about 88% classified themselves as part of the middle class. If I remember, perhaps it's 8% also. But of course, it's a self-identification. The other feature used for classifying middle classes, of course, the position, the labor mark, white collars are part of the middle class, but of course this traditional classification is problematic today. If you think on the call centers, are they white collars workers, or they are, of course, not middle class in terms of income, and income is the other of course, important factor to define middle class. As you know, I guess Ottaviano Canuto has mentioned this also some days ago. If you earn between $10 and $50 a day, you are part of the middle class, which is also a very bad criterion for defining middle class. Just to say, middle class was in the period of progressive governments in Latin America, there has been an issue. The disputes on definition of middle class, the self-identification of middle class, governments addressing the issue of middle class. This is what interests me, how middle class is mobilized as a concept, as a kind of label for attracting people to vote in a party or in another. Göran Ternborn in a conference I think 2016 said that the conflict between labor and capital was a conflict of the 20th century, and now the conflict in the 21st century is the conflict on middle class. But of course, this conflict is not really on middle class as defined by social scientists, but on the label middle class. This is the issue. And if you ask me how this is important, Dilma Rousseff, as you know, created a kind of agency to defining middle class. So this must be an important issue. If you create an agency to define what is middle class, this is an important political issue. If you take her program, 2014, Mais Reformas, Mais Futuro, I guess this is the number of the program of Dilma Rousseff. She said, after taking millions and millions of people from poverty, now our first and most important task is to keep these people as part of the middle class. This is in their government program. So this is a political issue. And I found very, very interesting what you said, Maria Herminia, but I don't think that is so to say, a counter-argument against the importance of middle class. You are only saying that people don't believe that they are, so to say, brought to the middle class, of course in quotation marks, because of government, but because of their own merit. But it's also part of our ideology of middle class, to believe in meritocracy. So, you see, the whole thing is a political issue and not a sociological definition of the middle class. And to your question, Lena, when PT showed a commitment with mitigating inequality, take the program of Lula 2002. You see there, I'm quoting from memory, but it's something like this. We are committed with more equality in this country. Therefore, our first reform would be a tax reform in order to promote a real redistribution of income in this country. You see this in his program 2002.
Check again, because I work on the program always. All the logic of market incorporation was defined.
No, the practice is one thing. The commitment is another.
Yeah, but I'm talking about discourse, and the discourse of equality was there. Yeah.
Well, first I'll say something about middle class too, but I don't think that the word or the notion, it may be that in a survey in Argentina, 80% say I'm middle class. It doesn't matter in practice. It doesn't matter in policy. It doesn't matter in the issue is when it's society government relations. It has to do with the protection of workers. That is, whether you are a salaried formal worker, informal sector. Formal, informal is one characteristic that is very important. With the proportion of informal sector workers, and some informal sector workers may be highly paid, so it's not that it's an underclass. Yeah. It's not an underclass. So self-employed, informal sector, salaried workers of various sorts. You mentioned call centers. What about government not hiring workers, but tertiarization, how do you call it? That you give outsourcing in government services and so on. So I think that the whole, whatever goes on in terms of occupations and labels and positions is very much in flux, and it's very heterogeneous, and so people catch up to what they can. Sergio, you mentioned something about me. I'll say something else about Argentina. Middle class. Remember that the Kirchner government began in 2003 after the big crisis of 2001, which meant an incredible decline in well-being of everybody or of great parts of the society. So that data of 2015 about poverty, about some of those data, indicate that the situation is similar to the one before the crisis of 2001. This was a major crisis. So it's a question of just recovery, and there is no redefinition of identities. It's just to hold on to what you were or to come back to what you were. So this is the mood. It's not, so I would say that I'm also very puzzled by the use of the idea of a new middle class in Brazil. We do have mass consumption for decades now in Argentina, not necessarily financialized, but refrigerators for urban working classes is a question of the 1950s. It's not a question today. Today, like one of the ministers of this new government said, how come people are complaining? Why are they taking vacation and they go to Brazil for a vacation and they have a cell phone? And so saying that working classes should not be consumer classes, so something of that sort. So this is, I think that in a comparative perspective, the whole thing of whether there is a shift in the positions in the labor market of people or of the labor market structure, or whether it is perception and media using certain labels is something that we should be able to separate and distinguish and make a distinction. I'll say something about family planning. I agree totally with what Lena said. The issue is an issue of rights and rights of persons, in this case of women. And one of the things that is important to remember is that although fertility has declined in all age categories except the adolescents. So adolescent pregnancies is something which is a major issue, and it's a major issue because it creates positions, disadvantaged positions that will last and that will be transmitted. And I think that there are very few governmental programs dealing specifically with that, and sexual education in schools, which would be the key issue here, has some quantity and quality problems. Quantity means we have in Argentina a law of universal sexual educación sexual integral, and every school should be. Now, who's teaching that? In which way? So it's a question of whether the schools take it or not, and second, what quality of education that the kids get, and the results are in the making. That is, adolescent pregnancy is not diminishing as it should. As it should from a perspective of the rights of women and of their life chances in the future. I didn't give any, Maria Herminia, I didn't give any data on the proportion of public and private schools in Argentina. I didn't look for it. I just took this kind of very visible data about comparing both. But there has been, both private and public schools are very heterogeneous, but I don't have the data that you gave. I don't have them here. I would have to do the exercise that Marco did. It was public in Argentina. It turned more private. It's highly heterogeneous. Private schools are usually, in many tests, worse. In specific, when you take a city like in Buenos Aires, private schools have worse results than public schools, yet public schools are in the city of Buenos Aires relatively good as compared to the suburbs. The Gran Buenos Aires is much worse. So I think that what I wanted to bring out is just the issue of the importance of education and of the importance of state policies regarding education that may have long-term effects of inequality.
we have reached our ceiling for this session. Thank you very much, and Professor Tavares de Almeida will close this call right now. Okay.
Some practical announcements. The certificates will be sent to you by email. You please give us 2 weeks in order to have them. And you will receive also by email a very short questionnaire evaluating the school. And please take some minutes to answer them, because we need them in order to plan other schools like this, and also to present to FAPESP. A school is basically, a school like this is basically an intellectual endeavor. And what we have tried to do here was to take some topics that we consider important topics in contemporary democratic society, but also they are related to the topics, some of the topics we research at Cebrap. So the idea was not choosing any topic we think is interesting, but trying to develop, to enrich the discussion we have at Cebrap, and we have at the international postdoctoral program to which the school is linked. The school is part of the international postdoctoral program. If you like the school, please put a good word to your friends about this program, which is, we think, and we're trying to build as a very interesting program. And so what we want to thank here is to all colleagues that came from Brazil and other parts of the world, and that allow us to make this interesting discussion. We want to thank you all very much for your participation, not only those that presented the papers and submitted the papers to discussion here, but everybody who during 5.5 days were here with us and made good questions, interesting points, and contribute with us to having a very lively discussion. But a school is also entails a lot of work, organizational work, and this is the moment we should acknowledge some people that help us very much to bring this and to make the school true. First of all, we'd like to thank Sandra Matos at Cebrap, who was our administrative support, Professor Andrea Naum, who made all these relations to University of São Paulo, help us to get this auditorium, the coffee break, and etc. We want also to thank the 6 IR students that were perfect in the reception. Isabela Brandi, Edmilson Capó, and Gabriela Groll in the morning, Tiago Ferreira Vieira, Jaqueline Arruda, and Otávio Torres, they are there. Let's thank them for their work. Perfect. But everybody who came here, during months, this school meant one person, and this person is Edson Bicudo, who made all the work of connecting, of answering emails and of sending emails. It's an enormous amount of work. I think I and Martha think that it would be impossible to have the school if we didn't count on the generosity, the capacity of Edson. Edson, please. Thank you so much, Edson. Edson is part of the International Postdoctoral Program, but in the last 3 or 4 months, I think that part of his life was dedicated to connect with you and make sure that you came here. Also, we at this moment must be grateful to Faculdade de Filosofia, Ciências e Letras, who hosted us for 2 days, Biblioteca Brasiliana, who allows for discussing a very nice and comfortable environment, CAPES at the Ministry of Education, and FAPESP here in São Paulo, who gave us funds to organize the school. I think that's all. Do we need to thank someone else, Marta? Well, so thank you very much for coming. I hope that you bring home interesting things, interesting questions, especially interesting relations. One of our ideas that it was creating an environment where young scholars and young researchers could know each other, could exchange their experience, and so we continue to be a part of SPASS. Thank you so much. Have a nice trip back home for those who came from far away, or not so far away, and have a good holiday. Bye-bye.